Berlin. April 1964. The city is magnificent. The Avenue of Victory stretches 5 kilometers from end to end, twice the width of the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Flanking it on both sides, the granite and glass facades of ministries, embassies, department stores and apartment blocks rise in perfect imperial order. At the far end, catching the gray morning light like a warship emerging from fog, stands the Grand Dome of the Reich, the largest building ever constructed by human hands, tall enough to generate its own weather system, wide enough to swallow St. Peter's Basilica in Rome 16 times over. This is the capital of a continent. And somewhere in the gray waters of a lake on the western edge of this city, a body is floating face down. This is where our story begins. Not with generals or battles. Not with flags or fanfares. But with a dead man in a swimming costume, and the detective who pulls him from the water, and the secret that dead man carried with him that was so dangerous that an entire empire had to be mobilized to make sure it stayed buried. My name is not important. What is important is what I am about to show you. Because this story, the story of Robert Harris's novel Fatherland, published in 1992, is not simply a work of fiction. It is a thought experiment about power, about memory, and about what happens when the most powerful nation in human history decides that certain truths must never be allowed to surface. The fictional world of Fatherland is built on one question. What if Germany won the Second World War? And underneath that question, hidden beneath layers of alternate history and political thriller, lies a second question. A real one. A documented one. What did they do to the Jews of Europe? And how hard did they work to make sure nobody would ever find out? Let us begin. To understand Fatherland, you must first understand the world it describes. It is April 1964. Adolf Hitler is about to celebrate his 75th birthday. The Greater German Reich stretches from the Atlantic coast of France to the industrial wastelands east of Moscow. Europe is not a collection of independent nations. It is a single economic community, 12 countries bound by treaty to Berlin, using the Reichsmark as their common currency, teaching German as a mandatory second language in every school, watching German television, listening to German radio, buying German cars, working in German-owned factories. The Second World War, in this world, ended in 1946. Germany defeated Russia in the spring of 1943 by cutting Moscow off from the Caucasian oil fields, starving Stalin's war machine of fuel. Britain was blockaded into submission and surrendered. Churchill fled to Canada. A nuclear standoff with the United States produced a Cold War that has now been frozen for nearly 2 decades, with the American and German empires facing each other across the Atlantic in a state of armed, exhausted tension. Now, in the spring of 1964, that tension is about to thaw. President Joseph Kennedy of the United States, son of the former ambassador to London, has agreed to visit Berlin in September for a historic summit with the Führer. It will be the first face-to-face meeting between the leaders of the two superpowers. The Nazi regime has staked everything on making this summit happen. It represents legitimacy. It represents survival. It represents the moment when the Reich stops being the world's open wound and becomes, officially, permanently, a fact of life that the world has chosen to accept. And it is precisely at this moment, with the cameras being positioned and the bunting being ordered and the security being planned, that a dead man surfaces in the Havel lake on the western edge of Berlin. His name is Josef Bühler. He is 64 years old. He was once the Secretary of State of the Government General, the Nazi administrative territory carved out of occupied Poland during the war. He is found floating in a swimming costume, missing 1 foot, in water that was freezing cold the night before. The detective assigned to the case is SS Sturmbannführer Xavier March of the Berlin Kriminalpolizei. And this is where the story truly begins. Xavier March is not a typical Nazi. He drinks. He smokes. He was decorated for bravery in the U-boat fleet during the war, and then spent the following 2 decades quietly building a reputation as one of Berlin's best detectives, while equally quietly refusing to join the party, refusing to give the Hitler salute with any genuine conviction, and refusing to pretend that the world he lives in is the world he would have chosen. He is not a hero in the conventional sense. He is something more uncomfortable than that. He is a man who has spent his entire adult life working within a criminal system, telling himself that doing his job well, solving crimes, pursuing the truth, is enough. That staying inside the system and doing it honestly is better than stepping outside and doing nothing. By the time Fatherland begins, even he is no longer sure that is true. When he pulls Josef Bühler's body from the lake, his initial assessment is straightforward. Old man. Swimming costume. Cold water. Probable drowning. Possible suicide. Happens twice a month in Berlin. File the report, move on. But something is wrong. The dog at Bühler's villa on the exclusive island of Schwanenwerder, home to the Nazi elite, has been beaten and muzzled. There is a bottle of vodka on the kitchen table, almost empty, though Bühler was a strict teetotaler. The jetty at the back of the property bears fresh damage consistent with a boat having docked in rough water. And on the dead man's face, barely visible, are bruising patterns consistent with someone having been forcibly held down. This was not a suicide. Before March can pursue these threads, the Gestapo arrives and seizes the case. The file is classified as a matter of state security. March is ordered to stand down. The implication is clear. Whatever Bühler was, whatever he knew, it is nobody's business but the state's. But then a second man dies. Wilhelm Stuckert, former Secretary of State at the Interior Ministry, found shot in his apartment alongside his Polish mistress, with a suicide note on the dining room table and a set of compromising photographs scattered nearby. The official verdict is suicide. The photographs were being used for blackmail. The old man cracked under pressure. Case closed. March does not believe it. Because Stuckert and Bühler knew each other. Both were senior Nazi functionaries from the war years. Both had retired quietly to comfortable obscurity in the 50s. Both had died within 48 hours of each other, and both cases had been immediately seized by the Gestapo under the personal direction of SS Obergruppenführer Odilo Globoknik, a man with a reputation so dark that even other senior SS officers spoke of him in lowered voices. And then there is the third man, Martin Luther, former Undersecretary of State at the Foreign Ministry, reported missing by his wife on Monday morning. Last seen boarding a plane to Zurich. 3 men, all senior Nazi officials from the war years, all retired, all dead or missing within the space of a week, 2 weeks before the most important diplomatic summit in the history of the Reich. March is a good detective. He knows when something is being covered up. What he does not yet know is what is being covered up, or how vast the darkness is that he has stumbled to the edge of. He is about to find out. The American journalist Charlotte Maguire arrives in this story the way trouble always arrives, through a door you left slightly open. She was the one who found Stuckert's body. She had an appointment with him. He had called her the previous Saturday night, desperate and frightened, from a public telephone box because he was certain his apartment line was monitored. He told her he had information that certain people in power needed to hear. He told her she would become the most famous journalist in the world. He told her to come to his apartment at noon on Sunday. She came. She found him dead. The Gestapo expelled her from Germany for fraternizing with a German citizen without official authorization. Her press colleagues lobbied and bought her a week's extension, which is running out. She has nothing to show for her time in Berlin except a dead source and a revoked visa and the gnawing certainty that she has brushed the surface of the most important story of her generation. When March finds her, sitting in a bar in the Potsdamer Strasse surrounded by other foreign correspondents, she is not frightened. She is furious. The alliance between the German detective and the American journalist is one of the most compelling relationships in the novel, not because it is a love story, though it becomes that, but because of what each of them represents. March is a man inside the system who has finally seen enough to understand that the system itself is the crime. Charlotte is a woman outside the system who has the tools to expose it, but needs someone on the inside to show her where to look. Together, they follow the thread. It leads them to Zurich, to a numbered bank account opened in July 1942 by Martin Luther, with 4 keys, to a safety deposit box that has not been opened in 21 years, and to the contents of that box, which is not gold, not cash, not stolen artwork, but something far more dangerous than any of those things. Documents. A collection of documents so carefully assembled and so meticulously preserved that their mere existence represents a direct threat to the legitimacy of the greatest empire in the world. What are these documents? That is the question that will occupy the rest of this video. And the answer, the real answer, drawn not just from Robert Harris's fiction but from the actual historical record, is what makes Fatherland not just a great thriller but one of the most important alternate history novels ever written. Because the documents in that Swiss safety deposit box are real. Or rather, they describe real things. Real meetings. Real orders. real decisions made by real men in real rooms that really existed. The fiction is the framing. The horror is genuine. Before we open that safety deposit box, we need to spend time in the world that made it necessary. Because the most unsettling achievement of Robert Harris's novel is not its thriller plot. It is the texture of daily life it creates. The mundane, grinding, ordinary reality of a Nazi-dominated Europe in 1964. A world that has had 20 years to settle into itself. A world where the horror is not in the screaming and the boots and the searchlights. All of that happened long ago, and the people who remember it have learned not to speak of it, but in the silence. The comfortable, well-fed, well-dressed, well-entertained silence of a continent that has chosen not to ask certain questions. Let us walk through that world for a moment. You wake up in Berlin in April 1964. Your apartment is a Volkswohnung, a people's housing unit, standard allocation for citizens of your economic bracket. It is not large, but it is solid. The rent is manageable. On the wall of the lobby downstairs there is a portrait of the Führer in a silver frame, surrounded by a wreath that your building's block leader organized for the upcoming birthday celebrations. You take the U-Bahn to work. The carriages are clean and punctual. The platforms display posters reminding you to report suspicious packages, suspicious conversations, suspicious behavior. The alert level, displayed on a color-coded panel at every police station in the city, has been on red for as long as anyone can remember. There is always a terrorist threat somewhere in the Eastern Territories. The partisans never stopped fighting. 20 years on, they are still out there, beyond the Ural Mountains, bleeding the Wehrmacht dry in a war that the newspapers describe as a series of glorious defensive victories, and that the soldiers who come home in sealed railway carriages late at night describe in rather different terms. You arrive at work. You are a secretary at one of the ministries, or an engineer at one of the vast industrial combines that have swallowed the resources of a dozen conquered nations, or a teacher, instructing children in the correct prayers to say before and after their school meals, not prayers to God, who is officially discouraged, but to the Führer, who replaced him. Before lunch, you listen to the radio. The announcer tells you that Kennedy has accepted the Führer's invitation. The summit will happen in September. There is music, The Merry Widow, Always the Merry Widow, Hitler's favorite operetta, the soundtrack of the Reich, and then more announcements about the Führertag celebrations. On Monday, the Führer will travel from the Chancellery to the Grand Dome for the Thanksgiving ceremony. 3 million people are expected in Berlin for the occasion. Hotels were booked out months ago. At work, someone makes a joke about the alert level and then glances sideways, checking who heard them. In the evening, you eat your dinner and watch television. The Reichsrundfunk broadcasts a drama about a family of loyal German settlers in the Eastern Territories, building a farm in the rich black soil of Ukraine. They are happy. The locals who used to live there are nowhere to be seen. Nobody asks where they went. Your neighbor, a retired Orpo officer, mentions that 2 of the senior officials who used to live on Schwanenwerder have died recently. A shame. Good men, from what one heard. One of them used to serve in the government general during the war. Important work, somebody had to do it. He shrugs. These things happen. You nod. You do not ask what things. This is the world of Fatherland. Not a world of constant terror and jackboots and screaming. A world that has made its peace with what it did. Or rather, a world that has decided, collectively and individually, that peace is only possible if the question of what it did is never examined too closely. It is a world built on forgetting. And forgetting, as Xavier March is about to discover, requires maintenance. One of the details Harris gets exactly right is the bureaucratic machinery required to sustain a lie at imperial scale. The Gestapo in Fatherland's 1964 is not primarily an instrument of mass terror anymore. That phase is over. The camps are gone. The populations are gone. The machinery was dismantled long ago, its components scattered, its records buried or destroyed. What the Gestapo does now, its primary daily function, is maintenance. It listens. It watches. It files. It ensures that the version of history that the Reich has chosen to present to itself and to the world remains unchallenged. This is why, when March begins pulling at the thread of Josef Bühler's death, the response is so immediate and so overwhelming. Not because Bühler was important. He was a retired old man living quietly on an island with a collection of stolen paintings and a dog. But because of what Bühler knew. and more precisely, because of what Bühler, Stuckert, and Luther together knew, and had preserved, and had hidden. The cover-up that March uncovers is not a recent conspiracy. It is a 20-year-old one. It begins in the summer of 1942, when 3 senior Nazi officials, Bühler, Stuckert, and Luther, all lawyers, all bureaucrats, all deeply embedded in the machinery of the regime, attended a meeting that changed everything they thought they understood about their own government. The meeting was real. It took place on the 20th of January, 1942, at a comfortable villa on the shore of the Wannsee Lake on the western edge of Berlin. 15 men attended, all senior officials from different government ministries and SS departments. The meeting was chaired by Reinhard Heydrich, chief of the Reich Security Main Office, and lasted approximately 90 minutes, after which lunch was served. In 90 minutes, the fate of 11 million people was discussed, organized, and delegated. This is not fiction. This happened. The Wannsee Conference of January 20th, 1942 is one of the most documented and most chilling events of the 20th century. Its minutes were drafted by SS Obersturmbannführer Adolf Eichmann and edited extensively by Heydrich himself. One copy of those minutes survived the war, discovered by Allied investigators in 1947. It is 15 pages long. It is written in the careful, precise, bureaucratic language of German civil administration. And it describes, in that language, the planned systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe. The document opens with Heydrich establishing his authority. He had been charged, he explained, by Reichsmarshal Göring with coordinating the practical implementation of the final solution to the Jewish question across all relevant government agencies. The purpose of the meeting was to ensure unified action. The term used throughout the document is Endlösung, final solution. The document identifies the Jewish population of 31 European countries and territories, listing them by nation with precise numerical estimates. France, 865,000. The Netherlands, 160,000. Poland, 2,284,000. Ukraine, 2,994,684. The total figure identified for the final solution is 11 million people. The document then discusses methodology. Jews capable of work would be organized into large labor columns, separated by sex, and marched into the eastern territories for road construction. The majority, it notes with clinical detachment, would in the process be eliminated through natural wastage. Those who survived, being, the document suggests, the most physically resilient, would need to be dealt with appropriately, since they represented the greatest biological threat to future generations. The language throughout is this careful, this deliberate, this clean. Heydrich had already edited out the most explicit discussion of killing methods. In Eichmann's original draft, a section described the different techniques that had been tried: mass shootings, carbon monoxide gas vans, and the experimental use of Zyklon B at Auschwitz on Soviet prisoners of war and Polish Jews, with promising results. Heydrich replaced all of this with a single sentence. It was agreed that different types of possible solutions would be discussed. In the margins of Eichmann's draft, next to the passage about Zyklon B, Heydrich wrote one word: no. Not because he objected to the method. Because he objected to having it written down. This distinction, between what was done and what was recorded, is the engine of Fatherland's entire plot. The Nazi leadership understood, from very early on, that what they were doing was of a scale and nature that could not survive documentation. They were meticulous about avoiding written orders from the Führer himself. Hitler never signed a written order for the Holocaust. The command came verbally. Heydrich told Stuckert, in a private meeting shortly before the Wannsee Conference, that he had received the Führer's personal instruction in July 1941. The Führer had spoken plainly. The time had come. The biological foundation of Judaism had to be eradicated once and for all. This was the lesson of history. But Heydrich would not put that in writing. And so the bureaucrats who attended Wannsee went away knowing what they had been told, knowing what they had agreed to, knowing what their signatures and their attendance meant, and knowing that if things ever went wrong, if Germany lost, or if the regime changed, or if the world ever found out, they would have no written protection. No document proving they had acted under orders from the highest level. This is what terrified Bühler, Stuckert, and Luther. Not guilt. Not conscience. Protection. They were lawyers. They understood liability. and they had spent the years between 1942 and the early 1950s quietly, carefully, systematically building themselves a legal parachute, assembling the documents that proved not just what had been done, but who had ordered it, how it had been organized, and what the chain of command had been from the Führer's verbal instruction down through Himmler and Heydrich to the men who built the camps and ran the trains and maintained the crematoria. They hid these documents in a numbered bank account in Zurich, locked in a safety deposit box with 4 keys, in July 1942, 6 months after Wannsee, while the camps were still operating at full capacity. They were not heroes. They were not trying to expose anything. They were trying to survive whatever came next. Among the documents in Luther's safety deposit box in Fatherland is a personal account, written by Luther himself, of a visit he made to Auschwitz-Birkenau in July 1943. Harris based this account on documented testimony from actual visitors to the camp. What Luther describes, in the careful, almost dissociated prose of a bureaucrat trying to process something his mind cannot fully accept, is the complete operational sequence of industrialist murder. The transport arrives in the morning. 60 wagons of freight cars. The doors are unlocked. Inside, men, women, children, the elderly, infants. They have been traveling for 4 nights. They are given water. They are separated by sex and by apparent physical fitness. Those judged capable of work march in one direction. Everyone else, the majority, marches toward a screen of trees. Beneath the trees, concrete steps leading down to a large underground chamber. Benches. Numbered coat hooks on the walls. Signs in multiple languages reading baths and disinfection rooms. Attendants moving through the crowd, murmuring reassurances, helping the elderly and the sick to undress. An atmosphere of anxious but contained compliance. The doors close. On the grass above, a small van marked with Red Cross insignia arrives. An SS officer and a medical officer step out carrying 4 metal canisters. They lift covers set into the grass, ventilation shafts, and pour in the contents. A granular purple substance. They replace the covers, remove their gas masks, light cigarettes. 20 minutes later, the ventilation system engages. The doors open. The Sonderkommando, a special detail of Jewish prisoners who perform this work in exchange for their own temporary survival before they too are eventually replaced, enters with rubber boots and aprons and gas masks, and begins the process of clearing the chamber. The bodies are transported by elevator to the floor above, where barbers remove the hair, dental technicians extract gold fillings and bridges, and the bodies are loaded onto rolling platforms and fed into the furnaces. Capacity: 2,000 bodies per day in this installation alone. 4 such installations operating simultaneously at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Total daily capacity: 8,000. The trains run every day. The railway schedules in the documents, real documents, preserved in German archives, show the relentless mechanical rhythm of the operation. Białystok to Treblinka. Loaded at 9 in the morning. Arrival at noon. Unloaded, the wagons fumigated. Departure that evening, empty, back to Białystok. Ready to be loaded again at breakfast. The hair from the women's heads, 3,000 kilograms per month, the equivalent of 1 freight wagon, was processed into felt and used to make slippers for the crews of German U-boats and insoles for the boots of railway workers. This detail appears in a real circular, issued by SS Gruppenführer Richard Glucks, chief of the concentration camp administration, in August 1942. It is one of the documents Harris reproduces in Fatherland. It is genuine. The matter-of-fact administrative tone of that document, the instruction that hair of 20 millimeters or longer should be collected, sorted by sex, and reported monthly to the central office, is perhaps the single most devastating detail in the entire novel. Not because of its content, which is horrifying enough, but because of what it reveals about the bureaucratic infrastructure that made it possible. Somebody drafted that memo. Somebody typed it. Somebody distributed it. Somebody filed the monthly reports. Hundreds of ordinary people, sitting at ordinary desks in ordinary offices, maintained the paperwork of systematic mass murder with the same diligence they would have brought to any other administrative task. This is what Fatherland is really about. Not monsters. Bureaucrats. Not extraordinary evil. Ordinary compliance. The numbers in the documents are the hardest thing to hold in the mind. 11 million people identified for the final solution. 6 million Jewish victims confirmed by historical scholarship. 1,250,000 per year at the operational capacity described in the camp documents. 8,000 per day at Auschwitz-Birkenau alone. These numbers mean nothing and everything simultaneously. The human mind is not designed to process them. A single death is a tragedy that can be understood, mourned, given weight. 6 million is a figure that the mind approaches and then slides away from, unable to gain purchase. This is why the documents matter. Not the totals but the specifics. The train from Białystok that leaves at 9 in the morning. The 3,000 kilograms of women's hair. The 4 metal canisters lowered through the ventilation shafts. The numbered coat hooks. The signs in multiple languages. The specificity forces the mind to stay present. To not slide away. Xavier March, sitting on the floor of a cheap hotel room in Berlin in the early hours of the morning, reading these documents one by one, experiences exactly this. He cannot process 6 million. But he can process the train schedule. He can process the coat hooks. He can process the image of a woman turning to look in a mirror before the doors close, adjusting a coat she has been told to remember the number of so she can find it again afterward. He can process the fact that somebody told her that lie. Somebody stood in that room and said those words knowing they were false, knowing this woman would never need her coat again, and said them anyway because it was easier if she did not know, because it made the logistics simpler, because it made the process run more smoothly. This is the heart of Fatherland. And this is the truth that Heydrich's regime in 1964 is desperate to keep buried. Not because the German people would be shocked. Not because the world would be outraged. But because the summit is in September. Because Kennedy is coming. Because legitimacy is within reach. Because 20 years of carefully maintained silence has almost worked. All it requires is that the last 3 men who preserved the documentation be silenced before they can use it. Bühler and Stuckert are already dead. Luther is running. March is closing in. To understand why Odilo Globoknik is murdering these men in the spring of 1964, you need to understand what was at stake. The summit between President Kennedy and the Führer was not merely a diplomatic formality. It was the culmination of 2 decades of careful, patient, extraordinarily expensive work by the Nazi regime to normalize itself on the world stage. After the war ended in 1946, Germany was the dominant power in Europe but an isolated one. The Americans maintained their distance. The British, humiliated and diminished, nursing their grudges from their Atlantic exile, refused any meaningful engagement. The Soviets were contained but not defeated, waging a grinding partisan war in the eastern territories that consumed German lives and German resources with no end in sight. The regime's survival depended on ending that isolation. On being accepted. On being treated, finally, as a normal state among normal states. For nearly 20 years, Heydrich and his apparatus had been systematically dismantling the evidence of what Germany had done. The camps were demolished. The records were classified or destroyed. The surviving witnesses, both perpetrators who might talk and victims who had somehow escaped, were hunted down with methodical patience. The language of the Holocaust had been scrubbed from official discourse. Even the word itself did not exist. There was no word for it because there was no acknowledged it. What had happened to the Jews of Europe? They had been resettled in the East. This was the official position. Nobody asked what resettlement meant. Nobody asked where exactly in the East. Nobody flew over the sites and noticed the absence of any settlements. Or if they did not say so in any forum where it could be heard. The system worked because it was not maintained by force alone. It was maintained by the very human desire to not know things that are uncomfortable to know. By 1964, an entire generation had grown up in a Europe where the question of what had happened to the Jewish population was simply not asked. Not because asking was always dangerous, though it sometimes was, but because not asking was easier. Because the answer, if it came, would require a response. And responding would require a reckoning. And reckoning is painful. So the silence held. Until Bühler, Stuckert, and Luther decided to break it. Not out of conscience. This point needs to be made clearly, because it would be comforting to believe that what drives Fatherland's plot is the belated moral awakening of men who participated in atrocity and eventually could not live with themselves. That is not what happens. What drives these three men is fear and self-interest. They are old. They are watching their contemporaries die, not of natural causes, but of carefully arranged accidents and convenient suicides. They understand, with the cold clarity of experienced bureaucrats, exactly what is happening and why. Heydrich is closing the circle. The men who knew, who attended the meetings, who signed the documents, who made the machinery work, they are being eliminated one by one, quietly, so that when Kennedy arrives in September, there will be nobody left alive who can testify with any authority to what the Grand Reich actually did in the years between 1939 and 1945. Bühler and Stuckert and Luther want to use their documents as leverage, as insurance, as a guarantee of survival. If they can get this material into American hands, if they can make it public, then killing them becomes pointless. The secret is out. The cover-up has failed. And perhaps, just perhaps, the Americans will be sufficiently horrified to call off the summit, and the resulting international crisis will be too large for even Heydrich to manage quietly. They are not heroes. They are men using the evidence of their own crimes as a bargaining chip. But the evidence they possess is real, and getting it out of Germany and into the light is the only thing that matters. Odilo Globoknik is one of the most historically significant figures in Robert Harris's novel, and one of the most carefully chosen. The real Globoknik, known to his colleagues as Globus, was SS and police leader in Lublin during the war. He was the operational commander of what became known as Operation Reinhard, the systematic murder of the Jewish population of occupied Poland, carried out at three purpose-built extermination camps, Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka. These were not concentration camps in the sense that Auschwitz was a concentration camp. Auschwitz had an economic function, slave labor for the German war industry, with the gas chambers handling those deemed unable to work. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka had one function only: arrival, processing, death. There was no slave labor component, no prisoner population beyond the small Sonderkommando details who maintained the machinery. People arrived. They died. The camps existed for nothing else. Under Globoknik's command, approximately 1.7 million people were murdered at these three sites between 1942 and 1943. The real Globoknik was captured by British troops in May 1945. He committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule before he could be tried. Harris's fictional Globoknik has survived. He has thrived. He is now an Obergruppenführer, the second highest rank in the SS, working directly under Heydrich at the Gestapo headquarters on the Prinz Albrechtstrasse. He is the man Heydrich sends when something needs to be done that cannot be written down, cannot be delegated, cannot leave a trail. He is the perfect choice. Because Globoknik is already implicated, already damned. He has nothing to protect except his own continued existence and usefulness to the regime. And he will do whatever is necessary to maintain both. When March identifies Globoknik as the man who was present at Bühler's body on the night of the murder, the young SS cadet Jost sees him clearly, recognizes him from a lecture he gave at the training school. He understands that he is not dealing with a rogue operation or a departmental conspiracy. He is dealing with something that goes all the way to the top. Heydrich himself has ordered these killings. The Gestapo is not investigating a crime. The Gestapo is committing one. And March is now the only person standing between Globoknik and the last surviving witness. The final section of Fatherland is a race. Luther has been in hiding in the railway marshalling yards at Gotenland station since returning from Zurich. He has killed a vagrant and dressed the body in his own clothes to convince the Gestapo he is dead. The deception works, briefly, and gives him the hours he needs to make contact with Charlotte Maguire and arrange the handover. The plan is straightforward. Luther will meet Charlotte and Henry Nightingale, a second secretary at the American Embassy, on the steps of the Grand Dome at 9 in the morning. Nightingale will listen to what Luther has to say, examine the documents, and take them back to the embassy under diplomatic protection. From there they can be transmitted to Washington, to the press, to the world. It is a good plan. It has one fatal flaw. Someone has talked. The Gestapo intercepts the phone call between Luther and Charlotte, made from a public telephone box that Luther had been careful to scout in advance, whose number he had obtained by visiting the street several days earlier and noting it down. The Gestapo monitors every public telephone in the city. They have a recording of the entire conversation within minutes of it ending. At 9 o'clock on the morning of the 20th of April, the Führer's 75th birthday, with 3 million people filling the streets of Berlin for the celebrations, Luther descends the steps of the Grand Dome toward Charlotte Maguire, his hand raised in something between a wave and a supplication. He is shot through the head before he reaches the bottom step. A single high-velocity round, fired from a concealed position. No warning. No attempt at arrest. Luther has been identified as a potential defector carrying classified state information. In the logic of the Gestapo, this makes him a traitor. Traitors are not tried. They are eliminated. The sound of the shot reaches March, who is parked on the edge of the square watching the meeting point, a fraction of a second after Luther falls. Everything that follows is chaos. March gets Charlotte and Nightingale into his car and drives. Nightingale, shaken and suddenly calculating the political implications of what he has witnessed, retreats toward the safety of his embassy and his career. March drives south, toward the border, toward Switzerland, toward a bridge over the Rhine that he visited 12 years earlier on honeymoon and has never forgotten. But March has something that the Gestapo does not know about. When he retrieved Luther's bag from the lost property office at the Tempelhof airport, where Luther had deposited it before hiding in the marshalling yards, knowing that carrying it would be fatal if he was searched, he found the documents. All of them. Stuckert's sworn statement. Luther's account of his visit to Auschwitz. The Wannsee conference minutes in Eichmann's original unexpurgated draft. The railway schedules. The construction orders for the gas chambers. The circular about the human hair. March cannot get out of Germany himself. He knows this. His face is known. His name is on every alert list in the Reich. He will be stopped at the first checkpoint. But Charlotte can get out. She has a stolen identity, the driving license and passport of a young woman murdered on her wedding day, whose papers Max Jaeger had left carelessly in his desk drawer. She has blonde hair, newly dyed. She has an Opel rental car registered in a false name. She has the documents hidden in her luggage wrapped in birthday paper, disguised as a wedding gift. And she has the photograph. Hidden among the documents is a small sepia portrait that March found underneath the wallpaper in his apartment when he moved in after his divorce. A family. A man, a woman, a baby in arms, a small boy. They are standing in front of a painted backdrop of trees and fields. The photograph is dated 1929. The family's name, from the building records, was Weiss. They were Jewish. They lived in March's apartment before the war. And then they were gone, evacuated to the east, resettled, like everyone else, in the standard bureaucratic language of disappearance. March puts the photograph in the package because it is the only answer he has ever found to the question that has haunted him for years. Not 6 million. Not the statistics. One family. One apartment. One photograph under the wallpaper, left by someone who knew they would not be coming back and wanted, in some small and helpless way, to leave a trace. He gives Charlotte the package. He sends her south. He tells her to be at the border crossing at 9 o'clock, when every guard in Germany will have a radio pressed to their ear listening to the Führer's emergence from the chancellery, and a pretty blonde girl in a rental car is the last thing anyone will be paying close attention to. Then he goes north. What happens to Xavier March at the end of Fatherland is deliberately left unresolved by Harris, and this ambiguity is one of the novel's most discussed qualities. March drives north and east, deep into the former Polish territories, into the industrial wastelands of Silesia. He has Max Jaeger, his oldest friend and, he has now understood, his most consistent betrayer, handcuffed to the steering wheel of the car. He walks away across a field, toward a line of birch trees at the edge of what appears to be an empty plain. He is looking for something. He finds it. A single brick, half buried in the grass at the edge of the tree line. He picks it up. Scorched at the edges. Crumbling at the corners. But solid. Real. He looks around. Sees more. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Scattered through the grass, half submerged, invisible until you are standing among them. He is standing on the site of what was once a building. A large one. Globoknik told him there was nothing left. Not a brick. He was wrong. There are bricks. Not many. Not enough to prove anything to someone determined not to be convinced. But enough for March. Enough to make it real. Enough to make it something that happened in a physical place on a physical earth, and not an abstraction, not a set of numbers too large to comprehend, not a bureaucratic memo about hair. The last thing we see of Xavier March is him walking toward the trees with a pistol in his hand. In the distance, he can hear the sound of vehicles approaching, the Gestapo tracking him to the end. Whether he survives is not the point. Whether the documents survive is the point. And we will come to that. Here is where the fiction and the history converge most powerfully. The premise of Fatherland, that in a world where Germany won the war, the regime would work systematically and effectively to bury the evidence of the Holocaust, is based on something that actually happened. In the world where Germany lost the war, they tried to do exactly the same thing. In the final months and weeks of the war, as the Allied armies advanced from both east and west, the SS undertook a massive effort to destroy the documentary evidence of the extermination program. The gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau were dynamited in January 1945. The records at Treblinka, Belzec and Sobibor had been destroyed earlier, when those camps were closed in 1943 after the murder of their intended victim populations was complete. The bodies at mass grave sites were exhumed and burned. The Sonderkommando workers who had operated the machinery were themselves executed. The cover-up was not entirely successful because the war ended faster than the erasure could be completed. Because Allied forces arrived at camp after camp before the destruction was finished. Because survivors survived. Because some documents were preserved in Allied archives before German officials could reach them. Because one copy of the Wannsee conference minutes was found, by accident, in 1947. But the intent was there. And had the war lasted even weeks longer, had the Allied advance been slower, had the German defense held even a little longer, the documentary record would have been substantially thinner than it is. In Fatherland's world, that extra time existed. The war lasted until 1946. Germany had another year to destroy, to erase, to bury. And unlike the panicked, chaotic destruction of the real final weeks of the real war, the destruction in Fatherland's world was orderly, systematic, thorough. Conducted not by desperate men burning files ahead of advancing armies, but by the administrative apparatus of a victorious state with 20 years to finish the job. This is what makes Harris's thought experiment so powerful. It is not asking what the Nazis would have done if they had won. It is asking what they were already trying to do, and showing what would have happened if they had succeeded. Charlotte Maguire crosses the Rhine at 9 o'clock on the morning of the Führer's 75th birthday. The guard at the Swiss border post glances at her passport. A pretty blonde girl in a rental car, a wrapped gift on the back seat, a story about a friend's wedding in Zurich. The radio behind him is crackling with the crowd noise from the Führertag celebrations in Berlin. He stamps her documents. He waves her through. On the other side of the bridge is Switzerland. On the other side of Switzerland is an airport. On the other side of the Atlantic is New York, and the offices of newspapers that are free to print what they find, and a government that is about to have its September summit plans very seriously complicated. Harris ends the novel here, before we see what Charlotte does with the documents. Before we see the reaction. Before we see whether the world believes her, or dismisses her, or finds a way to look away. He ends it at the moment of potential, the moment when the truth has escaped the empire that tried to contain it, and the question of what the world chooses to do with it remains open. This is the right ending. Because the question it leaves open is not a fictional one. It is the question that the real history asks us, every time we encounter it. The villa at Am Grossen Wannsee 56-58 in Berlin still exists. It is a large, handsome house on the shore of the Wannsee Lake. In January 1942, 15 men sat around a table in its conference room and spent 90 minutes organizing the logistics of murdering 11 million people, after which lunch was served. Today it is a memorial and educational center. The House of the Wannsee Conference. Its rooms have been converted into permanent exhibition spaces documenting the history of the Holocaust, the process by which a modern European state constructed and implemented a program of industrial mass murder, and the long aftermath, the trials, the testimony, the documentation, and the ongoing work of memory and accountability. Every year, tens of thousands of visitors walk through those rooms. School children from Germany and across Europe. Historians. Survivors' families. People who come, as you might come to any memorial, to stand in a place where history happened and try to feel the weight of it. One of the rooms contains a reproduction of the conference table, a copy of the Wannsee Protocol, the 15-page document that is the only surviving written record of the meeting, and photographs of the 15 men who attended. Most of them look completely ordinary. Which, of course, they were. One of the things Fatherland predicts with uncomfortable accuracy is the structure of Holocaust denial. Glaboknik tells March, near the end of the novel, that it doesn't matter what documents exist. Nobody will believe it. The scale is too vast. The claim is too monstrous. People will say it is Allied propaganda, communist fabrication, Jewish exaggeration. They will say that even if some of it happened, the numbers are inflated, the methods are misrepresented, the context is being deliberately stripped away to malign Germany. He is not wrong about the mechanism. Holocaust denial in the real world follows exactly this pattern. It is not a single argument but a series of retreats, from denial of the scale, to denial of the methodology, to denial of the intent, to denial of the knowledge, to whataboutism and false equivalence and the suggestion that those who raise the subject are themselves motivated by bad faith. What Fatherland understands, and what the historical record confirms, is that this denial was not spontaneous. It was designed. The destruction of evidence was undertaken precisely because the perpetrators understood that without evidence, even certain knowledge could be made to look like uncertainty. Even documented fact could be made to look like contested claim. This is why the documents in Luther's safety deposit box matter so much within the novel's logic. Not because they tell us anything we did not already know, the Wannsee Protocol survived, the camp record survived, the survivor testimony survived, but because they represent the thing that every campaign of deliberate forgetting is designed to prevent. A witness who cannot be dismissed. A record that cannot be explained away. A fact that forces itself into the present tense. Let us return, one final time, to the 15 men around the table at Wannsee. They were not, for the most part, fanatical ideologues frothing with hatred. Some of them were. But most of them were what Bühler, Stuckert, and Luther are in Fatherland: lawyers, civil servants, technocrats. Men who had built careers in the machinery of state and had learned, as all such men learn, that the machinery does not stop for moral objections. That your job is to solve the problem placed in front of you, to make the thing work, to fill in the form correctly and submit it on time and show up to the next meeting and do it all again. Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, coined the phrase that has defined our understanding of this phenomenon ever since. The banality of evil. Not monstrous individuals committing monstrous acts out of monstrous motivation, but ordinary people doing their jobs, and the job, in this case, being the systematic murder of an entire people. Eichmann, in the dock in Jerusalem, did not present as a monster. He presented as a bureaucrat. A man who had organized the deportation of millions to the extermination camps the same way another man might organize a railway timetable or a distribution schedule. He followed procedures. He filed reports. He attended meetings. He was, in his own self-understanding, simply doing what he had been assigned to do within the system in which he operated. This is the most difficult thing that Fatherland asks us to confront. Not the existence of monsters, the existence of systems. Systems that can transform ordinary compliance into extraordinary crime. Systems that can make the filing of a transport schedule morally equivalent to pulling a trigger. Systems that can diffuse individual responsibility so thoroughly across thousands of participants that each one can tell themselves, with some measure of sincerity, that they personally did not do anything wrong. And the question that follows, the question that March spends the entire novel trying to answer without quite finding the words for it, is what you are supposed to do when you find yourself inside such a system. When you have been inside it your entire adult life. When your salary comes from it, and your career depends on it, and your son has already been recruited into its youth organizations, and your ex-wife has filed a report on your political reliability with its secret police. What do you do? March's answer, in the end, is not a heroic one. He does not expose the regime. He does not lead a resistance. He does not sacrifice himself in any deliberate or meaningful way. He simply follows the truth wherever it leads, past the point where he can retreat from it, until he is standing in a field in Silesia holding a scorched brick and listening to the sound of engines approaching through the trees. It is enough. It has to be enough. Because it is all he has. The photograph of the Weiss family is the emotional heart of Fatherland, and it is worth dwelling on for a moment before we close. March finds it under the wallpaper of his apartment when he moves in. A sepia portrait from 1929. A family, father, mother, baby, small boy, in front of a painted studio backdrop. Normal. Happy. Anonymous. He traces the name from the building records. Weiss. A common German Jewish surname. Jacob Weiss, tenant from 1928 to 1942. After 1942, nothing. No death record in Germany. No emigration record. No military record. No trace in any hospital or prison archive. Evacuated to the east. March looks for them for months. He visits the neighbors. He asks questions that polite people do not ask. He gets doors closed in his face and one old woman who tells him, as though stating the obvious, which it is, they were Jews. And that is all. That is the entire answer available to him, within the world he inhabits. They were Jews. And then they were gone. And nobody who is still alive and sane and free is going to tell him where they went or what happened to them there. He puts the photograph on his mantelpiece. He looks at it every morning. And eventually he puts it in the package with the documents, because it belongs there. Because the documents are the mechanism and the photograph is the meaning. Because the railway schedules and the construction orders and the conference minutes describe a system, and the photograph describes a family, and the connection between those two things is the whole truth of it, the thing that cannot be captured in statistics or policy language or legal testimony. A small boy. A painted backdrop. 1929. 10 years before the war. 13 years before the trains. Of the 15 men who attended the Wannsee conference in January 1942, 8 were eventually tried for war crimes. None received the death penalty specifically for what was discussed at Wannsee. Most received prison sentences that were substantially reduced on appeal. Several were released within a few years and returned to professional life in West Germany. Wilhelm Stuckert, the real Stuckert, not Harris's fictional version, served 4 years in Allied detention after the war, was released in 1949, and moved to West Berlin. He died in a car accident in December 1953 near Hanover. The accident was almost certainly not an accident. A post-war Jewish retribution group was believed to be responsible. Josef Bühler, the real Bühler, was extradited to Poland and tried there. He was convicted of war crimes and executed in 1948. Martin Luther, the real Luther, attempted to have his superior, Joachim von Ribbentrop, removed from office in 1943, failed, and was sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp as punishment. He was released in 1945 in poor health and died of a heart attack in May of that year. Adolf Eichmann escaped to Argentina after the war, living under a false name until 1960, when Israeli intelligence agents abducted him. He was tried in Jerusalem, convicted of crimes against humanity and crimes against the Jewish people, and executed in 1962. Odilo Globoknik was captured by British forces in Carinthia in May 1945 and swallowed a cyanide capsule before he could be questioned. Reinhard Heydrich was assassinated in Prague in May 1942 by Czech and Slovak agents trained by the British Special Operations Executive. He died of his wounds on the 4th of June. He was 38 years old. Hitler described it as the greatest crime against the Reich. Fatherland was published in 1992, nearly 50 years after the events it fictionalizes, and it asks a question that becomes more rather than less urgent with time. If the evidence disappeared, if the documents were destroyed, if the survivors were silenced, if the sites were demolished and the sites of the sites were developed and the people who remembered were dead, would the world believe it? Would the world insist on believing it, even without the evidence? Or would it find a way, slowly and collectively and without ever quite admitting what it was doing, to slide toward uncertainty? To allow the monstrousness of the scale to become, over time, an argument against the reality of the scale? To permit the very fact that something is too terrible to be believed to become, in practice, a reason not to believe it? Harris does not answer this question. He knows it cannot be answered from the comfortable vantage point of the present, where we have the documents, where we have the testimony, where we have the photographs and the sites and the decades of scholarship and the living memory of survivors. He can only ask it from the alternate present he has constructed, where the documents are in a safe deposit box in Zurich, where the survivors are gone, where the sites are empty fields in the industrial wasteland of Silesia, and where a detective is standing in that field holding a single scorched brick, listening to the engines of the vehicles that have come to stop him. What he has in his hand is enough to prove that something was here. Something was here. And that is where he leaves us. Robert Harris wrote Fatherland because he wanted to understand how a crime of this scale could be committed by a civilized modern state. How it could be organized, maintained, and concealed. How ordinary people could participate in it. And how, if history had gone differently, it might have been successfully buried. The answer he found, after 3 years of research into the actual historical record, is the same answer that historians and philosophers and survivors have been arriving at for decades. It was not chaos. It was order. It was not madness. It was bureaucracy. It was not the work of monsters acting outside the bounds of civilization. It was the work of a civilization that had dismantled the mechanisms designed to prevent it. Xavier March finds the brick in the field because he followed the truth past the point where it was comfortable or safe to follow it. He did not do it out of heroism. He did not do it out of idealism. He did it because he was a detective, and the first obligation of a detective is not to stop looking until he finds what is there. Charlotte Maguire crosses the bridge because she is a journalist, and the first obligation of a journalist is to make the hidden visible. And the Weiss family, Jacob and his wife and their baby and their small boy, in front of the painted backdrop in the studio in Berlin in 1929, are there because memory is the only obligation that belongs to all of us. Robert Harris sat down in 1989 and asked a question that the entire apparatus of the most powerful empire in the history of Europe was designed to prevent anyone from asking. What happened? And what would have happened if the evidence had not survived? We know the answer to the first question because people refused to look away. Because investigators preserved documents. Because survivors testified. Because historians kept asking. Because memory is not passive. It requires maintenance. It requires insistence. It requires the willingness to say, this happened, the evidence exists, and no version of events that contradicts it is acceptable. We do not know the full answer to the second question. And that uncertainty is the most important thing Fatherland leaves us with. If this video gave you something, if it changed something, or confirmed something, or forced you to sit with something uncomfortable for a few minutes longer than was comfortable, then please do 3 things before you go. First, hit the like button. It costs you nothing. It tells the algorithm that serious history deserves a serious audience. It helps this video reach people who need to see it. Second, subscribe to this channel if you are not already. Every week we go into the stories that were buried, the civilizations that were erased, the worlds that almost were. For example, Cleopatra, Carthage, the American Civil War, the Holocaust, the worlds that won and the worlds that lost and the truths that survived both. If that is the history you want, we are here every week. Third, share this video. Not to everyone. To one person. The person in your life who asks the serious questions. The person who is not satisfied with the official version. The person who would sit with a 50-minute documentary about a scorched brick in a Polish field and understand exactly why it matters. One person. That is all. The comment section is open. I will be in there. Leave your word, leave your question, leave whatever this video gave you that you need to put somewhere. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying. Something was here. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise.